The flight attendant didn't just tear her passport. She ripped it in half, then smiled, called airport police, and told the girl in front of her, "This doesn't belong to you, and neither does this seat." Right there, in first class, gate still open, half the plane watching, and one phone recording. Soraya didn't speak. She didn't flinch. She just looked down at the two halves of her passport on the carpet like someone had just cut a piece of her identity in half. Because they had. The flight attendant's voice was syrupy and sharp all at once. "People try this all the time. Fake passports, fake IDs, and always," she smirked, "in first class." She crossed her arms like she'd done something noble. Nobody knew who the girl in the hoodie really was. Not the flight attendant, not the cop walking toward her, not even the woman filming from seat 3C. But in 7 minutes, this entire flight, this airline, was about to wish they had known. "Tell us where you're watching from. What would you do if someone tore your passport right in front of you?" It started like any other boarding. Flight 382 from JFK to Heathrow. Full flight. First class, nearly booked out by business execs and a handful of influencers filming themselves in reclining seats. Then there was Soraya Fields, 20, hoodie pulled tight, sneakers laced, and a one-way ticket back from London after 2 weeks embedded on assignment. She didn't look like a first-class passenger, but that was the point. Undercover FAA inspections didn't require a uniform. They required truth, and truth had to walk in unnoticed. That's why Soraya dressed the way she did. No makeup, no jewelry, and no visible authority. She didn't need anyone's respect, just their reaction. And Marla Jennings, the senior flight attendant, had just given her more than enough to work with. It started with a look. Marla scanned her boarding pass and hesitated. Her eyes moved from Soraya's hoodie to her face, then to the passport. "You're in 2A?" she asked slowly. "Yes," Soraya answered. Marla raised an eyebrow. "A passport. This is a domestic flight." "It's an international route," Soraya replied evenly. "It's a valid government ID." Marla held up the passport and examined it like it was a cheap souvenir. Then, with a smirk and a flick of her wrist, she ripped it down the center. The sound wasn't loud, but it stopped time. 2 halves. 1 insult. 1 federal offense. Soraya didn't shout, didn't panic, didn't flinch. She knelt slowly, picked up the pieces, and stood tall. A few passengers gasped. A woman filming whispered, "Did she just—" That's when Marla waved over security. "Excuse me," she called to the gate officer. "We have a potential forgery. This passenger's documents appear fraudulent." The cop looked unsure but nodded. "Ma'am," he said to Soraya, "I'm going to need to ask you a few questions." Soraya turned to him calmly. "Sir, you just witnessed a federal document being destroyed." The cop blinked. "Ma'am, are you saying this is real?" "Yes," Soraya said. "And that woman just violated Title 18, Section 1543 of the U.S. Code, mutilation of a passport." He glanced at Marla, who had suddenly gone quiet. "But she said—" "She assumed," Soraya said flatly. "And you are?" the officer asked. That's when Soraya did the one thing no one expected. She tapped the side of her smartwatch. Red protocol activated. Clause 13. Authorization S Fields. Sky Ethics Mirror Link engaged. Across multiple systems, alerts lit up. FAA Ethics Division. Transportation Security Administration. Department of Aviation Compliance. Even ESG-linked financial networks received a red flag ping. Not a drill, not a glitch. A full-scale breach of ethical compliance at an international gate. But no one on the plane knew that yet. To them, she was still just some black girl in a hoodie trying to bluff her way into first class. Marla stood next to the gate, arms folded, proudly watching like she'd saved the day. She had no idea. She'd just destroyed the future of her airline with one rip. Minutes passed. The crowd grew quiet. Then the captain's voice came on. "Ladies and gentlemen, We've been asked to delay boarding due to a developing situation. Please remain in your seats. That was the moment Marla's smirk began to fade. The gate officer's radio squawked to life. Then another officer arrived. Then two men in suits with FAA badges walked in fast and silent. One of them pointed at Soraya. Agent Fields? Soraya nodded. Confirmed. Gate B terminal cameras rolling. Document destroyed in public view? Yes, she said calmly, holding out the shredded passport halves. The agent took them gently with gloved hands and slid them into an evidence sleeve. Thank you, he said, then turned to Marla. Step aside. Marla blinked. Wait, what? She was faking it. That passport wasn't even... The agent cut her off. You destroyed government property. You violated FAA Protocol 3A, 4C, and 7D. Marla looked around. Passengers were filming. The woman from 3C was crying quietly, whispering, I can't believe this just happened. The gate cop took a step back. You're with FAA? He asked Soraya, eyes wide. I'm more than with them, Soraya said. I'm authorized to trigger Clause 13. I just did. He paled. Marla finally whispered, Clause what? Clause 13, one of the agents said, is the FAA's nuclear ethics trigger. And you set it off, Soraya said, gaze cool, because you couldn't see past a hoodie. Marla was escorted off the gate. Within minutes, news spread. FAA command grounded the flight. TSA locked the gate. The airline's ethics score plunged on Sky Ethics Mirror. And just like that, $2.4 billion in ESG-linked capital froze. In first class, the passengers stayed seated, silent. No one looked at Soraya now the way they did before, not as a girl in sweats, not as a problem, but as the woman who just brought down an empire with one silent move. She sat in seat 2A, quietly. The agent passed her a temporary travel credential. We'll get you home, he said. I already am, Soraya replied. This is where I do the work. 5 years ago, Soraya Fields watched her mother disappear into the sky. Not metaphorically, not in some poetic, soft focus way. Literally. It was a rainy Tuesday in May when Flight 712 vanished from FAA radar over the Hudson airspace. A domestic route, perfect weather forecast. No warnings, just gone. 83 passengers, 7 crew members, and one woman in seat 4C, Helena Fields, FAA Senior Inspector of National Compliance and Soraya's mom. Soraya had been 15. What the news said, catastrophic mechanical failure. What her gut screamed, cover up. Her mother had just filed a damning ethics report on Skylift Airlines, detailing over 200 internal violations, including forged safety logs and discriminatory boarding practices. She was planning to testify before the House Subcommittee on Aviation Oversight. The hearing was scheduled for the very next day. But she never made it. The report was buried. The subcommittee hearing canceled. The ethics audit closed inconclusive. And Soraya? She never got to say goodbye. That was the day Clause 13 became real. It wasn't just a fail-safe. It was her mother's last-ditch blueprint to fix a system that didn't want to be fixed. Clause 13 wasn't stored in a file cabinet. It wasn't approved. It was blocked, intentionally, labeled too disruptive by the FAA's executive board. It would have granted the Ethics Division final emergency override on any airline operating under federal jurisdiction. It would have linked real-time passenger complaints to ethics scores affecting license renewals. It would have frozen ESG funding tied to airlines with repeated bias violations. It would have changed everything. But no one wanted that kind of transparency. So they killed it. They killed her. Except Soraya's mom had one last play. Before her death, she uploaded Clause 13's core into a prototype system she was quietly building. Sky Ethics Mirror, a live monitoring platform designed to track violations in real time using biometric access and encrypted triggers. She linked access to one biometric ID, her daughter's. Back then, Soraya didn't understand what her mom was doing. She was too busy being a teenager, too busy trying not to fall apart, too busy pretending she wasn't the girl who lost her mom to an airplane that never landed. But grief has a funny way of sharpening you. And by age 17, Soraya wasn't just studying engineering. She was tearing through FAA documents with a red pen. By 19, she was quietly recruited by the FAA's Experimental Compliance Initiative, Gen Z Ethics Integration, a program no one outside the agency had ever heard of. By 20, she'd logged more undercover flight miles than most senior agents. And now, 5 years later, here she was, standing at the gate in JFK, hoodie on, holding two halves of her own passport, watching the same system that failed her mother spiral into emergency mode because she tapped a single command. Clause 13. In the Security Operations Center, 4 terminals away, the screen went red. "Who the hell authorized this?" a supervisor barked. A younger agent scrolled down. "Fields," she said. "S. Fields." That name hadn't hit FAA logs in years. "Wait, isn't that—" The supervisor leaned forward. His eyes caught the subline. "Biometric verified. Authorized by Sky Ethics Mirror." "Get me Director Matthews," he said, picking up the phone. "Now." Back at Gate B, Soraya sat in the first-class seat that had nearly been taken from her. Not as a luxury. She didn't care about the champagne and lay-flat recline. It was about what it symbolized. Space, safety, dignity, all of which were denied to people who didn't look the part. And that's exactly why she was assigned here. Because when people saw her boarding first class, they made decisions. Quick ones, wrong ones. And Marla Jennings made hers loud and clear. When the agents arrived, sharp suits, federal ID badges, and composure that screamed, "Not here to smooth things over," Marla's face went pale. She'd been smiling just minutes ago. Now she was shrinking behind the service cart. "Who tore the document?" the lead agent asked. I did," Marla said. "But she was being rude. She didn't look like— it just seemed fake." "Did you verify it through the scanning system?" "No, but—" "Did you contact your supervisor?" "No." The agent turned to Soraya. "Do you have any other government ID?" She nodded and calmly handed him her FAA emergency field credentials. He looked again. Then he turned to the security officer who'd been called by Marla. "You need to step away," the agent said quietly. "You're no longer involved in this. This is a federal matter now." The cop took 2 steps back and kept his mouth shut. Inside her head, Soraya's thoughts were moving like clockwork. She wasn't angry. She was surgical. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure. The camera footage, the audio, the handling of a federal document, the clear racial bias, the failure to follow procedure. It would all be reviewed. Clause 13 didn't just trigger a flag. It triggered a systemic reset. Within 10 minutes, FAA suspended Ascendair's international operating privileges. TSA issued a soft lockdown of all Ascendair gates pending federal review. ESG tracking firms began downgrading Ascendair's ethics compliance score, triggering automatic alerts to investors. A $2.4 billion portfolio of ESG-aligned airline investments began freezing assets across 6 financial institutions. And it all started with Marla Jennings thinking she could tear up a girl's passport and get away with it. At FAA headquarters, Director Avery Matthews stared at the live Sky Ethics Mirror feed. He hadn't seen it run in full power since Helena Fields designed the architecture years ago. Now her daughter had used it, and it was working. He looked at his deputy. "We bury this," he said. "We burn with it." The deputy nodded. "The press is going to get it anyway." Matthews exhaled slowly. "Then maybe it's time. Let Clause 13 do what it was built to do." Soraya leaned back in her seat as the captain approached. He looked cautious. "Ms. Fields," he said gently, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I wasn't aware of what happened. This isn't how we do things." She looked up at him with calm eyes. "I know," she said. "It's how you allow things to be done." He said nothing. She didn't expect him to. At 7:42 p.m. Eastio, FAA issued a live statement confirming the first ever activation of Clause 13. Marla Jennings was taken into federal custody. Ascendair's CEO was summoned for emergency ethics review, and Soraya Fields became the most talked about name in aviation without saying a single word to the press. Back at her apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland, Soraya's inbox lit up. FAA, the White House Office of Ethics, Senator Marquez's staff, and one message from a name she hadn't seen in years, Director Evans, subject, Helena would be proud. She stared at it for a long time, and finally allowed herself to close her eyes, not to cry, but to rest. Because this time, the system didn't win. She did. For Soraya Fields, airports were never just airports. They were arenas. Spaces where power played out in micro moments. Who got waved through, who got questioned twice, who was told, "That's not your seat." Places where uniforms didn't always mean protection, and smiles weren't always safe. She had spent years studying these moments, first from the back row of economy, then from jump seats near crew galleys, and eventually from first-class cabins where her presence made people uncomfortable before she said a single word. Because it was never just about the seat. It was about who they thought deserved it. When the FAA assigned her to Flight 382, the choice wasn't random. It came after a string of flagged incidents on international routes from JFK, especially involving young, non-white passengers traveling alone in business or first class. The agency had received 13 anonymous complaints in 90 days. Most were dismissed by the airline as misunderstandings or training issues. But one complaint stood out. A black woman in her mid-30s, a corporate attorney flying to London, had submitted a typed report. She detailed being asked to show her boarding pass 3 separate times, while the white man next to her in the same row wasn't asked once. Then she overheard a crew member mutter, "I swear, it's like they're testing us these days." She'd filed the report under a pseudonym. Soraya knew why. It was easier to stay silent than be branded difficult at 35,000 feet. That report triggered an internal flag. That flag triggered an undercover assignment. And that assignment led to Soraya boarding Flight 382 with a valid first-class ticket, a navy blue hoodie, and no announcement of who she was. Just her name and her presence. The FAA didn't typically assign inspectors as young as Soraya to first-class audits. Most inspectors were in their 40s, some pushing retirement. But Soraya wasn't typical. She'd come up through a different system, the Gen Z Ethics Integration Initiative, a pilot program designed after her mother's death to change the way the agency investigated discrimination in real time. Her job wasn't to ask questions. It was to exist, invisible, unimportant, unassuming, and see what came next. And what came next on Flight 382 was Marla Jennings. Soraya first noticed her during pre-boarding. She moved like someone who thought she was the main character, every step sharp, every word louder than it needed to be. The kind of flight attendant who didn't just scan passes, she performed judgment. She smiled at white families like they were old friends. She joked with a group of finance bros heading to London for a conference. But when a hijabi woman approached with 2 children, Marla's tone stiffened. "Are you sure this is your group?" Soraya clocked it immediately. Bias by tone, one of the most insidious forms. You couldn't write it up, but you could feel it, like static electricity in the air. When Soraya stepped forward, Marla didn't hide the scan. Eyes to hoodie, eyes to passport, eyes to face. Then, skepticism. 2A? She asked. "Yes," Soraya replied. "Passport?" Marla's hand was already half out. Soraya handed it over, calm. Marla turned it over once, twice, held it to the light, then made a small sound in her throat, a cross between a laugh and a scoff. "A lot of people trying stuff lately," she said under her breath. "What kind of stuff?" Soraya asked politely. Marla didn't answer. Once on board, Soraya slid into seat 2A. She set her backpack down gently and took a breath. It wasn't nerves. It was calibration. How much would she need to shrink herself today? She didn't have to wait long. Marla reappeared. Just confirming? You're alone? Yes. Marla's eyes narrowed like she didn't believe it. Then she walked off without another word. The couple in 2B and 2C gave Soraya sympathetic half smiles. The man looked like he wanted to say something but didn't. That was the pattern. Witnesses who saw but weren't sure how to name what they saw or what to do with it. 20 minutes before takeoff, Soraya opened her tablet to review the live ethics watch list, a beta program she helped develop with the FAA. Marla Jennings's name wasn't on it. That was interesting. It meant she'd never triggered a formal complaint that escalated to central review. Or, if she had, it had been buried at the station level. Soraya had seen that before too. Managers who protected toxic employees because they were efficient or good at keeping boarding on time. The airline didn't care about microaggressions if the plane left the gate at 4:59 instead of 5:04. But Soraya had a different clock. She wasn't watching departure times. She was watching people. Just before final boarding call, the real moment happened. Marla returned to Soraya's row with another attendant. She had Soraya's passport in hand. "Sorry, one more check," she said, flipping it open again. "This picture looks a little off." Soraya blinked. "It was taken 5 years ago. You look younger now. Strange. Maybe I aged well." Marla smiled tightly. "Or maybe this isn't your document." Soraya's breath stayed steady. "Is there an issue with the passport itself?" Marla didn't answer. She just looked over Soraya's outfit. Hoodie, joggers, no carry-on Louis Vuitton, and made a decision. Rip. The sound tore through the cabin louder than the engines. A woman in 3C gasped. Someone whispered, "She just..." Marla dropped the two halves on the floor like trash. "People like you can be creative. We've seen it before." That was it. The moment the test ended. The moment the investigation began. Because Soraya didn't reach for the flight crew. She reached for her watch and triggered Clause 13. Now, as she sat quietly in the same seat, feet flat, hands calm, watching the cabin dissolve into panic. And federal officials pour through the jet bridge. She thought of her mother. Helena Fields had once said, "Justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it rides coach in a hoodie and waits." And right now, that justice was sitting in seat 2A, waiting no more. Fake passport, suspicious attitude, possibly stolen identity. That was the report flight attendant Marla Jennings gave airport police when she radioed them from gate B32. And that was the lie Soraya Fields now had to stand in the middle of, surrounded by passengers, stares, whispers, and silence thick enough to crush bone. The two halves of her U.S. passport sat on the carpet like broken wings, torn clean through the center seam, as if it was nothing, as if she was nothing. Marla hadn't just torn a document. She'd torn through Soraya's right to belong, and somehow she looked proud of it. Marla stood stiff by the jet bridge, arms folded like a courtroom prosecutor ready to win. Her voice, loud enough for those in the cabin to hear, dripped with false concern. "I've worked flights for 17 years. I know when something doesn't feel right. That ID didn't match. The way she avoided eye contact, the attitude, something was off." She glanced at the white officer now standing next to Soraya. "You're trained to spot that too, aren't you?" The officer looked uncomfortable. His name tag read Mitchell, and he shifted from foot to foot like a man who didn't sign up for this but wasn't sure how to back out. "Ma'am," he said gently, "can I see any other ID?" "No," Soraya said, her voice cool, deliberate. "Because the one I had, the one issued by the United States Department of State, was ripped in half by your witness." Mitchell turned to Marla. "You tore it up?" "She forced my hand," Marla snapped. I wasn't going to let someone sneak into international first class with a fake. She didn't force you to tear anything, said a new voice. Low, firm, and quiet. Everyone turned. The woman from seat 3C stepped forward, phone still recording in her hand. She looked Marla dead in the eye. I've been filming this whole thing, she said, and nothing about her behavior was threatening. You didn't even scan the passport. You just tore it up because… What? She wasn't wearing a suit? She had braids? Marla scoffed. I don't take instruction from passengers. No, the woman said, but you might want to listen to your union rep after this goes viral. Soraya remained still. She knew how this played out. Seen it too many times. The woman gets loud. The system circles around her. The narrative shifts, and the victim becomes the threat. But not this time. Because this time, Soraya wasn't just someone with a camera phone. She wasn't just another angry black girl trying to speak calmly while someone turned up the volume on her skin color. This time, she had Clause 13, and it was already in motion. 12 minutes earlier, she'd tapped her smartwatch, confirmed biometric ID, triggered the SkyEthics mirror backend. And now, federal eyes were watching everything from 3 different offices. Back at FAA's National Ethics Response Division in D.C., Agent Callum Hayes stared at the red alert flashing across his screen. It was unmistakable. Clause 13 activated. Subject S. Fields. Gate B-32 JFK International. He turned to his supervisor. Sir, we've got a live trigger. Full override. The supervisor straightened up. Is it real? Callum typed quickly, pulling footage from JFK's camera grid. Then he saw it. A young woman in a gray hoodie, standing in front of a gate counter. A white flight attendant tearing a passport. Passengers looking stunned. The girl not yelling, just watching. And then, the unmistakable flash of her mother's face. Helena Fields. Except no, it wasn't her. It was her daughter. Back at the gate, Soraya stared at Officer Mitchell. You're asking for ID, she said. I gave you one. She destroyed it. That's not suspicion. That's destruction of federal property. I didn't know it was real, Marla interrupted. You didn't check, Soraya corrected. You made an assumption. Marla bristled. You don't know me. No, Soraya said, finally raising her voice just enough to land. But I know your type. I know what you look for when you decide someone doesn't belong. I know how your smile disappears when someone challenges your authority, and I know how you reach for rules when you're scared of being wrong. Her words cut cleaner than any yell. You wanted a reaction? Here it is. I'm not leaving, I'm not apologizing, and I'm not the one in violation here. Just then, the gate door beeped open. 2 agents in dark suits stepped through, badges out. FAA. Everything stopped. Passengers fell silent. Even the crying toddler in 2C stopped fussing. The taller of the 2 agents looked around. Ms. Soraya Fields? He asked. Soraya stood. Yes. We've received your trigger. Please confirm authorization code. She gave it. He nodded. You may remain seated. Then he turned to Marla. You'll need to come with us. Excuse me? Marla blinked. You've been cited for destruction of federal documentation, denial of service, and potential violation of federal ethics protocol under Title 49. Marla looked toward the gate officer, then toward Officer Mitchell. Wait, you're arresting me? No, the FAA agent said. We're investigating you. In the background, phones lit up again. Someone whispered, She's FAA? Oh my God, another muttered. That's what she meant by Clause 13. Even Mitchell looked like he'd seen a ghost. You're federal? He asked, mouth half open. Soraya turned toward him slowly. I'm a field inspector for the FAA's Office of National Ethics and Compliance. My badge number is 94SF013. This flight was part of a classified ethics audit assigned 14 days ago. You, sir, are now standing in an active federal investigation zone. I suggest you stop assuming things. Mitchell took a literal step back. The FAA agents motioned to the gate staff. Boarding is suspended. We'll need all logs, recordings, and incident reports. This entire area is now under review." Passengers were quietly filming again. Marla was trembling. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then, finally, quietly, "I didn't know." Soraya met her gaze for the first time since the tear. "You never asked," she said. 15 minutes later, Marla was escorted off the premises. The gate was closed. The airline's legal team was notified, and across multiple networks, the ethics score for Ascend Air dropped like a stone. By the time Soraya finally sat back down in 2A, the entire tone of the cabin had shifted. No one looked at her the same. Not with pity, not with confusion, with respect. As the agents debriefed her, one of them leaned closer. "Your mom, she was Helena Fields, right?" Soraya nodded, slow. "She would have been proud of what you just did," the agent said quietly. Soraya didn't smile, but she did finally blink away the burn behind her eyes. "Yeah," she said. "She taught me everything I needed to know." By the time Soraya's flight lifted off, delayed, half empty, and under silent FAA observation, the fallout had already begun. What Marla Jennings and the gate crew didn't know was Rang Clause 13 wasn't just a field alert. It was a system-wide trigger tied into a dormant ethics framework co-authored by Soraya's mother, Helena Fields. A framework that every FAA-compliant international airline had agreed to but never thought would be used, until now. And it only needed one incident, one inspector, and one verified breach to snap the whole thing into motion. 22 minutes after the incident, at FAA's Central Ethics Core in DC, the server room lit up like a command center mid-crisis. 6 monitors flashed in unison, red bars pulsing across the screens. A white banner displayed the active escalation. Clause 13, Global Protocol Escalation. Active. Status. Validated. Subject, Soraya Fields. Authorization, Gen Z. Inspector 033. Callum Hayes hadn't moved from his desk since the trigger. He watched the locks cascade across partner airline systems. Skypath, Routegate, Cloudboard, Trust Lane, all scrambling as security layers began shutting down integration. "Is this impacting Ascend Air's loyalty channels?" he called out. "Already collapsing," an analyst replied. 32 international partner airports have suspended our flight ethics handshake protocol." Callum stood up. 32? 36 now. Singapore too. At JFK Terminal 4, Ascend Air's VP of Global Operations, Rhonda Webb, was still mid-coffee when her legal advisor burst into the room. His voice shook. "Ma'am, FAA just issued a Clause 13 on us." "What?" she blinked. "Our ethics rating just dropped to Level 4 non-compliant. That activates auto-suspensions with every international gate that opted into Helena Fields' ethics treaty. And we have a lot of gates in that network. I thought that protocol was symbolic. Not anymore. It's been reactivated by a verified inspector." Then came the second notification. 2.4 B worth of route-based funding, ESG accounts, and international insurance guarantees had been frozen pending full audit. Rhonda dropped her cup. On board Flight 382, Soraya sat quietly in 2A. The plane had finally taken off, but the cabin felt eerie. Half the first-class passengers had opted out once they heard the flight was flagged for federal ethics monitoring. She didn't mind. She wasn't flying for comfort. She was flying for mission, for memory, for her mother, and maybe, just maybe, for a system that could finally be forced to tell the truth. The flight attendant assigned to her row hadn't even made eye contact since the boarding door closed. Soraya didn't need them to. She just needed the data trail to keep uploading, which it was, straight from her FAA-registered smartwatch, now synced to the ethics network's mirror. She sipped water, didn't blink, waited. Mid-flight, the woman from seat 3C came over, hesitant. "I hope it's okay I say this," she offered. "But the way you handled everything, that was brave." Soraya nodded slightly. "Thanks." The woman hesitated. You were the trigger, weren't you? The one who caused this? Soraya didn't answer with a smirk, just said, yes. The woman looked stunned, then relieved. I've flown 126 flights in the last 5 years, and I've seen what they get away with. But not this time, thanks to you. Online, chaos had broken loose. The original video had now racked up 4.2 million views on TikTok and had been reshared by major outlets. Twitter threads broke down what Clause 13 actually was. YouTube creators analyzed the footage frame by frame. Legal experts were calling it the most impactful ethics audit since 2009. Trending tags appeared, #claused, #GateB32. Soraya was right that this is why we audit. Even celebrities weighed in. But behind every post, the same question simmered. Why did it take so long for one black woman's dignity to matter at this level? At FAA headquarters, Administrator Lyle Brenner stared at a live map of international airports going gray, signaling suspended cooperation with Ascend Air. We're going to be dealing with global fallout, someone said behind him. We already are, Brenner replied. Initiate formal advisory. All carriers with level 3 or lower ethics scores have 14 days to submit complete transparency reports, or they'll be suspended too. One aide hesitated. You're invoking Helena Fields' full protocol? She died trying to get it passed, Brenner said. It's about time someone activated what she built. He stared at the monitor. Her daughter just forced us to face what we ignored. When Soraya landed at Heathrow, a quiet car met her on the tarmac. 2 U.S. consulate officials, 1 British ethics liaison. No press, no press conference, just silence. In the car, one of the officials handed her a card with no name, no seal, just a handwritten message. You didn't burn the system. You forced it to see itself in the mirror. Keep going. She placed it in her jacket pocket. Her phone buzzed. 43 missed calls, 700 messages. Some reporters, some lawyers, some allies, some strangers. But at the top was a voice message. She tapped play. Her mother's voice came through. If you're hearing this, baby, it means you stood your ground. And if you stood your ground, then the system blinked first. And you, my love, just made history. Soraya leaned back, looked out the window as London blurred past. No fanfare, no music, no final applause, just quiet. But this time, it was the kind of quiet that meant something had finally cracked. And this time, it wasn't her. It was a strange kind of calm that followed. Not the calm of peace, no, that hadn't come yet. This was the silence of waiting, of watching dominoes tip in slow motion and knowing you had pushed the first one. Soraya sat in the corner booth of a quiet hotel cafe near Mayfair, the morning after the landing. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours. Her email inbox was a war zone. Her phone had frozen twice from the volume of alerts, but she was exactly where she needed to be. Her job wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. She pulled up the dashboard on her tablet, Sky Ethics Mirror. The interface, once dim and buried, was now alive with live feed data. Suspended clearances, airport inquiries, airline ethics audits, funding requests halted by ESG compliance filters, all of it spiraling in real time. Her mother had once told her, "You'll know it's working not when they apologize, but when they start to panic." They were panicking now. A knock on the window startled her. She turned. Agent Denise Rathmore, FAA London liaison, stood on the other side of the glass, trench coat soaked from the rain. Soraya waved her in. "Morning?" "Barely," Denise said, shaking off water as she slid into the booth. "You slept?" 2 hours. You?" "Same, but we've got bigger news than sleep." She slid an encrypted folder across the table. Ascend Air just attempted to bypass the ethics freeze by rerouting flights under their code-share partner, Bravia Lux. They thought no one would notice. Soraya opened the file and scanned. They tried to proxy their clearances using a Swiss shell company. Exactly. But clause extensions already flag shared routing. You baked that into the protocol? Soraya nodded. Mom did. I just made it visible. Denise chuckled, half impressed, half exhausted. They're scrambling, Soraya. CEOs are on emergency calls. 2 major investors pulled out this morning, $620 million, gone overnight. I haven't seen this kind of systemic freeze in my entire career. Soraya sipped her tea. That's because it's never been triggered by someone they didn't see coming. Meanwhile, back in the US, a very different kind of meeting was happening. In a boardroom atop Ascendair's Manhattan headquarters, CEO Leonard Kraft was pacing like a caged tiger. We underestimated her, he snapped. A 20-year-old Gen Z inspector just shut down a $2.4 billion network. His general counsel, sweating bullets, replied, she wasn't just some inspector. She had emergency override codes, full FAA authentication. And she's Helena Fields' daughter. Leonard stopped pacing. He hadn't realized that part. She's Helena's daughter? Yeah. Apparently she finished what Helena started. The ethics mirror, Clause 13, all of it. Kraft leaned forward. Then we don't just have a compliance problem. We have a legacy problem. He turned to his PR team. I want a memo drafted. Something soft, apologetic, but not too apologetic. We admit confusion, but no guilt. And what if the FAA goes public with the audit? Someone asked. Kraft paused. Then we flip the narrative. Say it was a misunderstanding, a tech glitch. Racism is hard to prove, right? The room went silent. One woman near the back stood up quietly and left. Back in London, Soraya entered the FAA satellite office, an underground space tucked beneath a joint intelligence hub in Canary Wharf. She was greeted with nods, not applause, and that's how she liked it. Respect, not noise. Agent Rathmore debriefed the morning team. Clause 13 remains active. Our ethics partners in Canada, Japan, and the Netherlands have joined the freeze. That's over 41 airports worldwide suspending Ascendair gate privileges. Soraya sat down at the terminal and pulled up a private thread, one only she could access. It was her mother's original logic map, a spider web of conditional triggers, auto-escalation flags, accountability filters, press response matrices, a roadmap for how to fight silent discrimination without yelling. Soraya tapped the blinking tab marked Phase 2. She hesitated, then activated it. Instantly, notifications began firing. Automatic audit requests sent to the top 15 US airlines. A press release time-stamped for 9:03 a.m. Embargoed, but ready, a data transparency portal unlocked for journalists and ethics boards. A global message. The passenger equity charter is no longer dormant. At Heathrow's press lounge, journalists scrambled. The FAA had just released the most detailed ethics breach report in aviation history, complete with real footage, timestamps, crew logs, audio transcripts, and compliance failures. It was damning. And the video from Gate B32? It was now part of the official federal record. The public wasn't just watching. They were demanding answers. Meanwhile, Soraya sat back, staring at the upload complete bar. A part of her wanted to turn off the tablet, get some sleep. But a bigger part of her knew she couldn't. Because she'd seen this play out before. Quiet cruelty, brushed off as protocol. But this time, she wasn't alone. People were watching, not just to see her win, but to see if someone like her could. Outside her hotel, 2 young black girls held up a sign as she walked past. It read, "Thank you for standing when they tried to silence you." She smiled, not for the cameras, not for the headlines, just for them, and for herself, because somewhere above all this noise, she knew her mother was smiling too. The next morning, the world looked different, not because the sun rose any brighter, but because it rose on an industry that had just been cracked wide open. Soraya didn't even make it out of the hotel lobby before her phone buzzed with another notification. Breaking, FAA confirms Clause 13 breach. 2.4B in airline compliance credits frozen. She watched the push notification slide across the screen, then another. Ascend-Air ethics rating drops to level 4. All routes to EU temporarily suspended. Senator Langford calls emergency hearing on airline discrimination. FAA confirms investigation into coordinated passenger profiling allegations. This wasn't just a news cycle anymore. It was a reckoning, and Soraya Fields was the face of it, even though she never asked to be. As she stepped out into the gray London air, a small group of photographers snapped photos from a distance. She kept walking, head up, trench coat pulled tight against the chill. She wasn't here to pose. She was here to testify. Inside the U.S. consulate's protected conference room, everything was sterile and silent. The legal team from Ascend Air had arrived early. 4 suits, 1 PR consultant, and a woman who introduced herself as External Ethics Counsel, which was code for damage control. Soraya, calm as ever, sat across from them. No blazer, no makeup team. Just a stack of documents, a laptop, and a small locket around her neck. Inside the locket was her mother's photo and the original signed page of the Passenger Equity Charter. "Miss Fields," began the lead counsel, clearing his throat, "we'd like to begin by stating that we acknowledge a lapse in protocol." Soraya cut him off without raising her voice. "It wasn't a lapse. It was a pattern. And I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for transparency." They blinked, unprepared. She continued, sliding a document across the table. "This is a breakdown of discriminatory boarding interventions on international flights logged between 2018 and 2024, based on FAA ethics reports and voluntary passenger filings. 94% of those incidents involved black or brown passengers. 82% occurred in first or business class." The woman labeled External Counsel tried to interrupt. Soraya didn't stop. "This," she said, tapping the document, "isn't about one gate agent or one bad apple. It's about a culture, one that's been allowed to grow in silence under the banner of protocol. But I'm done letting silence speak for us." Back in the States, news anchors couldn't keep up. Clause 13, once an obscure federal ethics clause, was now trending higher than most election news. TikTokers were using Soraya's testimony to voice their own travel discrimination experiences. Instagram was flooded with hashtags like #AuditTheAirlines and "Not Just Gate B32. YouTubers turned the boarding video into commentary essays and social justice documentaries. One creator said, "What Soraya did was show us that protocol without accountability is just legalized prejudice." And underneath the noise, something else was happening. Airline shareholders, quiet, powerful, and terrified, started demanding emergency board meetings. They didn't care about PR. They cared about compliance and money. At JFK Airport, a whistleblower came forward. Her name was Candace Monroe, a former mid-level employee at Ascend Air's Northeast hub. In a live stream viewed over 3 million times, she said, "I was trained to look for security risk behavior. You know what that meant? Hoodies, African-American accents, Spanish names, sitting in first class without obvious indicators of wealth. I felt sick every day going to work. But if you raised it, you got blacklisted." Her voice shook near the end. But Soraya stood up. "And now, I will too." Her confession triggered a secondary wave of public outrage. By nightfall, Ascend Air's CEO was trending, not for leading a global brand, but for being called to testify in front of Congress. Meanwhile, Soraya boarded a train headed to Brussels. The European Ethics Council had requested her presence, not for punishment, but for insight. They wanted to understand how the ethics framework her mother designed had worked so efficiently, and how they might adopt it formally across EU aviation systems. As she looked out the window, watching the countryside blur by, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You don't know me, but my son is 11. He saw what you did and said, 'That means people can't ignore me anymore, right?' Thank you." Soraya read it twice, then locked her phone, leaned her head back, and let herself smile for the first time in days. That evening, a secret internal memo from Ascend Air leaked online. It revealed plans the company had drafted just 1 year prior, a passenger stratification protocol designed to reduce disruption incidents by subtly filtering high-risk profiles from premium cabin upgrades. The wording was vague, but the intent was clear. Race, appearance, accent. It was all baked in. The memo set the internet on fire. Even longtime industry defenders had to backpedal. Senators began tweeting, FAA administrators released statements, and Helena Fields' name, once pushed into the background of bureaucratic history, was suddenly on the front page of the Washington Post. The woman who tried to warn us, and the daughter who made them listen. When Soraya arrived in Brussels, she wasn't greeted with applause, just a quiet nod from the ethics board chair. Miss Fields, he said gently, we've reviewed the architecture you reactivated. It's brilliant, brutal, necessary. She nodded. It wasn't mine. My mother built it. I just refused to let them bury it. He gestured for her to take a seat. We'd like your help, not just to investigate the breach, but to build something permanent. A system that doesn't rely on being embarrassed to function properly. She looked at him, steady. I'm not here to be anyone's hero, she said. I just want the next black girl with a passport to be treated like she belongs. And if she's not, then the system will know. This time, it won't be quiet. The room sat in silence. A different kind of silence. The kind that comes before reform. The kind that means they're finally listening. It was 6:42 a.m. when Soraya Fields stepped into the hearing room. The lighting was cold, clinical, the kind designed to keep people awake, alert, and honest. Across from her, lining the long panel table, were delegates from the FAA, the European Ethics Commission, and 3 voting members from the International Aviation Oversight Committee. Behind her sat a small audience. No cameras, no phones. This wasn't about performance. This was about the system. Agent Denise Rathmore gave Soraya a silent nod from her seat along the back wall. You ready? She'd asked earlier in the hallway. Soraya had smiled faintly. No, but I'm going in anyway. The chair of the hearing, a gray-haired woman named Commissioner Rebecca Lehman, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. Ms. Fields, she began, her voice deliberate but not unkind. You are here not as a defendant, but as a witness to a structural breach. Your actions initiated a multi-layered response that impacted 37 international airports and resulted in the temporary suspension of 5 transcontinental flight networks. Soraya nodded once. Correct. Before we proceed, we want to acknowledge that what you triggered was lawful, but law and precedent are not always aligned. Today, we'd like to understand your intent. That word, intent, echoed longer than it needed to. Soraya took a breath. My intent was simple, she said. I wanted to see if the system we built would actually work when someone who wasn't white, male, or powerful needed it to. Silence. Not defensive silence, considering silence. I wasn't testing the law. I was testing its courage. Back in the States, live coverage of the hearing wasn't allowed. But that didn't stop the internet from speculating. Clips of Soraya walking into the building, dressed in a simple navy coat, her locket just visible beneath her collar, were replayed over and over. She doesn't act like a whistleblower, one podcaster said. That's because she's not one. She's a system architect, and this is her final blueprint. Online, her name became a verb. To Fields, a situation equals to expose something buried under bureaucracy and force accountability. Urban Dictionary had it updated by noon. Inside the hearing room, the questions got sharper. What would you say to those who believe you acted with personal bias? Asked one commissioner. I'd say the entire system was biased before I touched it, Soraya replied. I just gave it a mirror. And what about the financial damage? That wasn't damage, that was disclosure. Lehman raised an eyebrow. Explain. For years, airlines have collected ESG funds, tax subsidies, and federal contracts under the claim of equitable service. But when a 20-year-old black woman gets her passport torn in first class, and the system calls it routine security, then clearly what they're selling and what they're doing don't match. One of the delegates leaned forward. "You're saying the breach already existed. You just revealed it?" Soraya nodded. "Exactly. Clause 13 doesn't cause failure. It registers it." That landed. After a brief recess, Soraya was asked to present her mother's original system map, the full life cycle logic of Sky Ethics Mirror, Clause 13, and the Passenger Equity Charter. She stood, tapped the screen behind her, and began walking them through the layers. Tier 1. Cabin class treatment disparities. Tier 2. Response time to complaints by race and gender. Tier 3. Patterns of document verification requests at gates. Tier 4. Escalation pathways triggered by voice, tone, or silence. Tier 5. Real-time audit flags powered by passenger-reported experience. The final tier was labeled Emergency Override, Legacy-Initiated Clause 13, Black Box for Ethics Exposure. The room fell still. Who had access to that override? One official asked quietly. "Only one person," Soraya said, tapping her own name on the interface. "Me." "And why did your mother build it that way?" Soraya looked up. Because she knew one day someone would need to act when no one else would. After the hearing, as the panel deliberated in private, Soraya sat alone outside on a low marble bench. A cold breeze swept through Brussels' government district, rustling the papers in her lap. Agent Rathmore eventually found her, holding 2 coffees. "Black, no sugar, like you hate your mornings," she joked, handing one over. "Thanks," Soraya murmured. "They're still in there. You made waves." "I didn't want waves." Rathmore sat beside her. "Waves make room for ships, for people who haven't crossed yet." After a long pause, she added, "I heard from Geneva. The UN Aviation Ethics Coalition wants you to speak next month." Soraya blinked. "Wait, what?" "They said they've never seen an enforcement protocol that clean, or that brutal. You embarrassed 5 countries into rewriting their passenger standards. Some of them are actually grateful." Soraya smiled, just barely. "My mother would have called that ironic." "No," Rathmore said. "She'd have called that progress." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the FAA released a statement summarizing the Brussels hearing. It ended with a single line. Ms. Soraya Fields acted within the ethical and legal scope of the Passenger Equity Charter. Clause 13 remains active. Review underway for global adoption. But what made bigger waves was what came 12 hours later. The FAA's main site quietly launched a new initiative, the Helena Fields Institute for Aviation Ethics and Passenger Equity below it. Founding Director, Soraya Fields. When Soraya returned to her hotel room later that evening, the window overlooked the Brussels skyline, old rooftops stitched between glass towers, history and modernity coexisting. She stood there, holding her mother's locket, thinking not about everything she'd just done, but everything that had almost never happened. What if she hadn't spoken up? What if she'd accepted the gate agent's apology? What if she'd let them tear the passport and walk away? The difference between silence and change, she realized, wasn't outrage. It was activation. Someone had to decide to do the thing anyway. She turned on the small desk lamp and opened her laptop. There were already over 9,200 flagged passenger complaints routed through the new system that morning alone, and she would read every single one of them, not because it was her job, because it was her turn. And now, finally, the world was listening. 3 days after the Brussels hearing, something unexpected happened. Soraya Fields got a letter, not an email, not a DM, not a push notification, a letter. Handwritten, on old cream-colored paper, folded neatly into a black envelope with a gold seal. No return address, no name. Just 3 words on the front in soft calligraphy. For what you did. Inside was a short note, It read, "You don't know me, but what you did changed the course of thousands of silent stories. The ones that never got cameras, never got hashtags. We saw you. And more importantly, they did too. Thank you." The ones watching quietly. Soraya sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. It didn't have the weight of power. It had the weight of witnessing. That morning, she arrived back at JFK for her first flight since the incident. The airport had changed in subtle but powerful ways. Digital screens now displayed a new passenger code of ethics. Staff uniforms had a small silver pin, the Clause 13 crest, signifying certified training. And more than anything, the eyes had changed. Not just watching for trouble, watching for dignity. A gate agent, this time a young black man named Marcellus, smiled as he scanned her boarding pass. "Miss Fields," he said with a nod, "we upgraded you to 1A. On us." She smiled back. "You didn't have to. We know, but this time we wanted to." She walked down the jet bridge, not as an inspector, not as a disruptor, but as someone finally being treated as she should have been all along. Midway through the flight, as she sipped her tea in first class, a little girl across the aisle kept sneaking glances. She was maybe 9, maybe 10. Brown skin, puffy ponytails, passport peeking out of her backpack. Her mom leaned over to scold her for staring, but Soraya just smiled. She leaned over gently. "It's okay." The girl's eyes lit up. "Are you the one who made the planes change the rules?" Soraya chuckled softly. "Sort of." The girl grinned. "My mom said you made it so people can't treat us bad in the nice seats anymore." Her mother flushed, embarrassed. "I didn't mean..." But Soraya cut her off with warmth. "You meant exactly what needed to be said." She pulled a small card from her coat pocket and handed it to the girl. It was a printed quote, her mother's favorite, the one that started it all. "Your presence is not a disruption. It is a design requirement. Helena Fields." The girl read it out loud, quietly mouthing the words, then held it like it was gold. That same week, FAA headquarters rolled out a sweeping set of reforms called the Fields Amendments, written in collaboration with Soraya, Denise Rathmore, and a panel of ethics engineers from 5 countries. The changes included mandatory ethics compliance audits every 90 days for international carriers, passenger profiling red flag alerts embedded in real-time crew apps, required first-class treatment bias training designed by psychologists and survivors, live recorded audit trail systems for every document-related passenger interaction, and perhaps most radically, the passenger override clause, allowing passengers to report ethics breaches in real time with temporary flag authority that automatically triggers federal review. Airlines hated it. Civil society didn't care. The world had changed, and they were going to keep up or be left behind. 2 weeks later, Soraya stood on a stage in front of 700 people. It was the Global Equity in Transit Summit. The theme, "Dignity is not optional." She was the closing keynote. And she wasn't there to talk about herself. She talked about her mother. "My mom worked behind the curtain," Soraya told the crowd. "She designed systems no one praised. Systems meant to protect the people who got stopped for not smiling, for speaking with an accent, for wearing a hoodie in the wrong zone." She paused. "They told her she was paranoid, that racism wasn't measurable. But she measured it anyway, and then she left it behind for someone like me to find." There was a hush in the crowd. Not sadness, reverence. "And now," she said finally, "now the system can't unsee what it's seen. You can fire a person. You can't delete an audit trail. That's the future she believed in. That's the future I insisted we deserve." The room rose in a standing ovation, but Soraya didn't smile for the applause. She smiled because somewhere she felt her mom smiling back. That evening, as Soraya left the event, she was approached by a young man in a security uniform. His badge said, "Sky Global Transit." He looked nervous. "Miss Fields," he said, voice shaky. "I was the one. at the original gate. The one who just stood there. I didn't say anything. I didn't help you. She studied him for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because I didn't want to be that guy. And because I want to be better. I took the new ethics training. I passed. But I still think about it every day. He looked down, ashamed. Is there any way to make it right? She gently touched his shoulder. You just did. At 1:17 a.m., Soraya got another anonymous message. This time through the newly launched Passenger Justice Line, which she now oversaw. It simply read, "We flew today. Me, my mom, my grandma, all in business class. No side eyes, no double checks, no whispers, just welcome aboard. You made that happen. Thank you." She read it twice, then closed the message and sat back in her chair. In the quiet of her apartment, in the middle of a changed world, Soraya Fields smiled. Not because she'd fought back, but because for the first time she didn't have to. 2 months later, Soraya stood in the lobby of a building that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't glamorous. No skyline views, no polished floors, no press. Just a gray structure tucked between a train yard and a forgotten freeway off-ramp in Baltimore. But inside, something new was happening. The Helena Fields Institute for Aviation Ethics and Passenger Equity had quietly opened its doors. And today, for the first time, Soraya was giving the orientation herself. She walked into the training room, where 24 trainees, some fresh out of college, others ex-flight staff, former inspectors, and a few whistleblowers, looked up with quiet curiosity. "Let me guess," Soraya smiled. "Some of you were expecting more tech?" There were a few chuckles. "You'll get that part later. But first, what this work is really about is patterns. Who gets doubted? Who gets delayed? Who gets discarded?" She walked over to a whiteboard and wrote 3 names. Malik, black, 14, VIP seat flagged. Amira, Muslim, passport re-verified. Javier, Latino, asked to change seats. Every one of these kids was flagged last month. Every one was in the right seat, with the right ticket, doing exactly what they were supposed to. She paused. And every one of them activated Clause 13. The room went quiet. Soraya pointed to a map on the screen behind her. 42 airports now live testing real-time ethics scoring. That's what you're helping us build. A world where power isn't based on perception, but on precision. Later that day, Soraya sat down in her office. Nothing fancy, just a desk, a worn leather chair, and a wall covered in handwritten notes and timelines. A soft knock. Agent Denise Rathmore stepped in, holding 2 folders. 2 things, she said, dropping the files on the desk. First, 4 more airlines just signed the passenger equity charter. That brings us to 26. And second, she came. Who? The flight attendant. Soraya blinked. Wait, the flight attendant? Vivian Matthews, the one who tore your passport. Silence. Soraya leaned back, processing. She's here? Downstairs. Says she doesn't expect forgiveness, just wants to listen. Soraya found her sitting alone on a bench near the security desk. Vivian Matthews looked different. Not older, just smaller. No uniform, just jeans, a gray sweater, and a face that carried months of silence. When she looked up, her voice cracked. "I didn't know who you were that day." Soraya sat next to her. "That's the point, Vivian. You shouldn't have had to." Vivian nodded, eyes stinging. "I've watched your hearings. I've read the stories. I even took the ethics training, but none of it changes what I did." "No," Soraya said quietly. "It doesn't." Vivian fumbled with her bag and pulled out something, a faded photo. "My daughter, she's 19, wants to go into international policy. I kept thinking if someone had done that to her, ripped up her passport, called the cops, would I have survived the shame?" Soraya looked at the girl in the photo. Bright eyes, same locket. "Wait, that locket, you gave that to her?" Vivian nodded. Her grandmother's. I didn't even notice you were wearing one that day. I was too busy making judgments. She stood slowly. I came to say I'm sorry. Not to erase it, just to face it. And with that, she left. Not forgiven, but seen. That night, Soraya walked the halls of the Institute. Each door had a name, not just rooms. Legacies. Room 4, Amara Tate. Room 6, Walter Greaves, Room 8. Maya Johnson, Room 9. Helena Fields. She paused outside Room 12. It didn't have a name yet, but it would. Soon. She pulled out her phone and opened a message draft to herself. You didn't fight to punish. You fought to protect. Now build the world you wish they'd built for you. Mom. She hit save. Tomorrow, there'd be more stories. But tonight, there was peace. And in the quiet hum of a building that shouldn't have existed, Soraya Fields, FAA inspector, reformer, and daughter of legacy, finally exhaled. 6 months later, Soraya found herself at the Capitol. Not for hearings, not for investigations, but for a ceremony. A quiet one. No media frenzy, no live-streamed outrage. Just a closed session of the Senate Subcommittee on Transportation Ethics. Inside, a new document was waiting. The Passenger Equity Enforcement Act, nicknamed the Fields Protocol. A law born not from politics, but from principle. Rooted in one moment, a torn passport, a broken assumption, and a girl who didn't back down. Miss Fields, the chairwoman began, adjusting her glasses. You're not here to testify. You're here because you changed the standard. Not just for passengers, but for everyone who thought ethics were optional. Soraya didn't speak right away. Instead, she looked around the chamber. It was lined with names and faces she used to only read about in textbooks. Now, they were nodding at her. Not because she was famous, but because she was undeniable. Finally, she said, I didn't do this alone. I'm just the part of the system that refused to look away. The room stayed silent, respectful, not awkward. And if you're voting today, you're not voting for me. You're voting for Amira, for Javier, for the kids who still get double-checked at the gate. You're voting so they don't have to fight their way into dignity anymore. One of the younger senators leaned forward. Miss Fields, when did you realize this was bigger than you? Soraya smiled softly. The moment someone ripped up my passport, and I realized they'd done it before, and would keep doing it unless the rules changed. The vote passed unanimously. The Fields Protocol was now federal law. That afternoon, she walked out of the Capitol and sat quietly on the steps, watching tourists and aides rush past. Then, out of nowhere, a woman approached. Early 60s, short silver hair, a cane, Haitian accent. You don't know me, the woman said, but I've worked in this industry 34 years. I've been ignored, humiliated, forgotten in crew rooms you wouldn't believe. She paused, holding back tears. But what you did, you gave us our name back. She handed Soraya a tiny envelope. Inside was a flight pin, faded, worn, the old kind they used to give stewardesses in the 80s. You earned this more than I ever did, she said, and walked away without waiting for thanks. Soraya held the pin in her hand. It weighed almost nothing, but it felt like everything. That night, back at the Institute, she stood by room 12, no longer blank. A small plaque now read, Room 12, Soraya Fields. For those who were never meant to be overlooked. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't moved, but because there was nothing left to prove. Tomorrow, there'd be more fights, more policy meetings, more audits. But tonight, she was home, and the system would never be the same again. 3 years later, the world had changed, quietly, but permanently. Not because one law fixed everything, but because one story refused to die. At JFK Terminal 4, a teenage girl named Laila stood nervously at the international gate. Her skin was dark. Her curls bounced nervously under a headscarf. Her documents were perfectly in order, but her eyes darted, waiting for something to go wrong. She'd read the stories, heard what used to happen. As she approached the counter, a uniformed agent looked up. Calm, professional. Then the screen lit up with a soft green flash. Passenger verified. Ethics compliant route. The agent smiled. Welcome aboard, Miss Karim. You're in 2A today, first class. Laila blinked. That's it? The agent nodded. That's it. Have a great flight. She walked down the jet bridge in quiet disbelief. No suspicion, no secondary screening, no one second-guessing her. Just respect. Like it should have always been. Back in Washington, Soraya stood before a new class of ethics fellows at the Helena Fields Institute. She no longer used notes. She didn't need to. Some of you think this work is about catching bad actors, she said. It's not. She paused, letting that land. This work is about pattern breaking, dismantling the quiet codes that tell people they don't belong. You're not investigators. You're mirrors. And the industry has to look into you now. A trainee raised her hand. Do people still push back? Soraya smiled. Every day, and every day, we push forward. That evening, Soraya visited her mother's grave. There was no crowd, no press, just a field of silence, and one woman standing with a promise kept. She knelt down and placed something on the headstone, her original passport, restored, laminated, with the tears still visible. I didn't fix everything, Mom, she whispered. But I made sure no girl ever has to hold her ID like it's a bomb. She stood. The system saw me, and then it saw you. She didn't cry. She smiled and walked away. Somewhere at 38,000 feet, a flight attendant helped a young black passenger find her seat. The girl looked hesitant, until she noticed a small patch on the attendant's lapel. Certified ethics trained, Fields protocol compliant. The girl relaxed, because even though she didn't know the full story, she knew she was safe. And somewhere in the sky, that was enough. Have you ever been treated unfairly just because of how you look, or where you're from? Because Soraya's story might be fiction, but the pain she faced, that's real for too many. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever seen someone stand up quietly, with grace, and change everything around them. And here's a question for you. If you had the power to freeze 2.4B over one act of injustice, would you use it to punish or to rebuild? Drop your answers in the comments, because your voice might be the next story we tell. This is Telltales, where one moment rewrites the system.